Okay, welcome everybody to a very special part two of the session specifically that has been designed for the Right to Clean Air Roadshow. This is a Thailand-based initiative driven 100% by volunteers and a collaboration between the Thailand Clean Air Network and the Circular Design Lab, which is an open innovation platform. So we've been working together for several months now, and tonight we've had two sessions at 5 p.m. just a few hours ago. We heard from the authors of the draft Thailand's Clean Air Act on the specifics around some of the policy dimensions, the regulations, and the suggested economic dimensions as well. For this next hour, we're going to be focusing outwardly. Not to say we're not focused on Thailand, but we're hearing from experts from around the world that are working on improving air quality from multiple levels and different dimensions. So we're really pleased to have that. Laura, if you could move to the next slide, that would be great. So I'm here myself, Courtney Savi-Lawrence, one of the volunteers with the Circular Design Lab, wearing also a hat during the day with the UNDP's Regional Innovation Team. And Laura, I'll have you introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Laura. I'm also wearing a second hat two hats between the Circular Design Lab and UNDP's Nature, Climate and Energy team, and very pleased to have you all here.
So what we wanted to do just before we dive in is to share a little bit of the context. In 2019, here in Bangkok, we had a series of different systemic design workshops on the weekends. And through that process, we were looking at a variety of different challenges, and air pollution being one of them, predominantly problematic here in the region, but certainly just as much in Thailand and in the city where we were living. And what we identified in terms of these leverage points, or these spaces that we wanted to take action, was policy as well as education and awareness. And the culmination of these two factors together have equalized to what we have now called a campaign, which is primarily digital, but sometimes on the road, depending on the COVID dynamic. But it's been a series of ways to share the information around what the Thailand Clean Air Network has been doing for the past several years, which is literally bringing together environmental lawyers, health specialists, academics, other activists to craft a rights-based and environmental-based legislation and policy brief. So we can share a little bit more about that towards the end. But what we do see, and we started in August for this specific campaign, is an attempt to better express the idea of how citizens can move a policy forward for the right to breathe clean air. The next slide, we'll share just a little bit so you have a bit of context of the journey that we've been on. This is something that is an endeavor that has reached many different people. And just last month, the Thailand Clean Air Network, or sorry, I should say in August, the Thailand Clean Air Network was granted the authority to start collecting what is required to have this legislation tabled to Parliament. And that is at least 10,000 citizen signatures. And the first 400 were collected here. You can see this image at the local Bangkok Arts and Cultural Center on a weekend that was dedicated to moving forward different organizations in civil society working on these types of issues. In the next slide, I would like to just quickly show a little bit of how we were thinking of this, designing this. So we didn't want to just only focus specifically on the science and the data and the information, which is so critical and crucial, but we wanted to think about how do we reach more people where they are. And so we first wanted to also start with what is the cause and the science. So in August, we had two sessions. One was specifically around the context behind the Thailand Clean Air Network's research. But then we also brought in entrepreneurs and others that are working in this space. Graviki Labs out of India, creating printing ink out of air emissions. E-Tron, the first electric motorbike company in Thailand that's trying to mainstream, but also create a battery subscription model. Entrepreneurs that are reframing from air pollution to assets. This was something that we are just testing. How might we have more people think about the issue that often is so abstract and intangible and complicated to consider on a human scale what you can do about, think about it in different terms, because certainly it's a complex issue that takes a variety of different responses. In September, we also started to do a deeper dive in terms of the cost and impact, but we also thought about the creative response that's possible. So not only did we emphasize or learn from those experts that were looking at the evidence behind the issues, as well as forecasting models in regards to the cost on your health and the cost on the environment and the ecology and ecosystems in terms of industrial emissions, in terms of pollution in general. But then how do artists get involved? What other ways might we be able to express our humanity in connection, in relationship to the environment, but to the issue as well? Last month was dedicated specifically to looking at the gaps that still exist. But not only that, but looking at it from a systems lens. What are the other elements? If we look at the sum and the parts, how might we be able to connect the dots in a more effective way and identify who are the other players in the ecosystem that are there? And as a result, of course, we don't want to say we have solutions. So that's why we've really framed this month's theme really about being towards solutions. So we're all experimenting in real time together. And what we're trying to do is amplify this experiment at scale. And today and tonight was really about bringing those worlds together so that we have a hyper-contextual analysis of what's happening in Thailand with relationship to the region, of course. And then we get an opportunity to learn and speak from other experts from around the world, looking at air quality from a variety of different lenses and some cutting edge research, as well as cutting edge climate finance tools that are being prototyped and developed. The last thing I'll mention is that we certainly don't want to ignore the fact that this is an issue that, of course, as we framed it, is a human rights issue, an environmental issue, but it's also a social justice issue. And so part of our campaign is about understanding how even though if it might be addressing a symptom, but how might we better protect those in our community with abilities and capabilities to defend the vulnerable from the harmful causes of the invisible killer, or PM 2.5, amongst others. So we were able to get a small grant from MIT to start mobilizing DIY air filter workshops. So we're going to be prototyping our first one in just a few weeks. So more on that at the very, very end. But just want to say thanks for joining us. This is being recorded. We do have Q&A options in the chat box, and it's a session, a webinar session. So we hope that we are able to create a really interesting conversation. Over to you, Laura, to move forward with the rest of the speakers and the session.
Thanks so much, Courtney. We have a great lineup tonight and really, or this morning, depending on where you're joining from. Wanted to introduce folks really briefly, but then we'll pass it right off and get started. So we'll hear from Jessica Sudden, who is the global lead for air quality from the World Resources Institute, joining from Vermont, as well as Stephen Bailey and Max Klotz from the IFC's climate business team on their new products development. And they're coming from Washington, DC, joining us early in the morning. Isabella Suarez is a Southeast Asia analyst at the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air and is currently in Cebu in the Philippines. And Diane Archer will be presenting more, bring it back home to Thailand for us. And she's a senior research fellow here with the Stockholm Environmental Institute, and will share some of the emerging work that's happening on air quality here in some cities in Thailand. So without further ado, Jessica, I'd like to pass it to you to get started. And but just a quick note that we do have Q&A throughout. So as Courtney said, please post your questions. We want this to be a conversation and an opportunity for us all to learn together and from each other. So you can either use the Q&A or if it's simpler for you to put something in the chat box, we're also watching that. And we'll pause for one question, one or two after each speaker, but then have a more open session a little bit later. So, but if you have questions as we go along, please do let us know. Without further ado, I'll pass it off. So over to you, Jessica.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
My sharing. There we go.
Great. Okay. There, so we've got the sharing part done. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be part of this panel and also to be an advisor for the great work that you're doing in Thailand. It's been incredibly exciting to see the way that you've sort of very strategically used institutional openings, how you brought in the science and run this series. And I'm truly, honestly, incredibly impressed. So thanks a lot, and it's an honor to be here. I'm going to run. So I was looking at your set of the series, and I was thinking, in some ways, what I'm about to say in the next 5-7 minutes may sound a little abstract, but I think it's incredibly important for the solutions community to orient where we're heading in a way that is enough to bring systemic change. There's a lot of attention to air quality right now, rightly, but there's also been a lot of attention in waves over the past 3 or 4 decades. And it's one of those things where I'm just consistently amazed, and I've been amazed in about the 20 years that I've been working on air quality. I'm a game theorist by training, so I work on how people make decisions, but I got involved in air quality early because when you look at what it does, I mean, I'm preaching to the choir, it's an incredibly important development, social justice, environmental, climate, ecosystem, animal rights, everything issue. The science has been clear. It's been clear for a long time, and it's only getting clearer. When you look again at the other side, solutions, if you start to look at it sector by sector, emission by emission, a lot of these things are known, they're technologically viable, they're cost effective, especially when you take into account the health and agricultural and climate benefits, but sometimes even when you don't, even when you're looking at it from a pure financial sense. I'd say agricultural solutions and the importance of agriculture and air pollution is slightly under-recognized, but we have these solutions. We've been writing about them for a long time. And so the big question for me in terms of solutions is really, what is the issue? Why do we at best play whack-a-mole, kind of solution by solution, issue by issue, sector by sector? Once in a while, we'll change one thing and then it'll go back. What is the deeper fundamental issue, and why we cannot get our act together to do more with what we know, with the tools we already have? And so in looking at that, we've at WRI, we've done a lot of work on looking at the political economy of air quality at the city level, at the regional level, over the past few decades. Where does it stumble? And one of the key points is that it's not enough to ask for clean air, because the sources of pollution are often not obvious and not politically obvious, and they're easy to dispute and easy to deny. And so in some ways, it's a little bit like asking for equality. It's nice, but how do we get there? This is an issue where the science says that you can have agricultural emissions, gas, ammonia, along with energy and fossil fuel emissions that produce particles. How intuitive is that? It's not. It's maybe a fact, it's not intuitive. So there's a lot of room for obfuscation about what is a clean air action. And with that, the political momentum for clean air often just disperses. And we see that over and over and over again, from the US to Mexico to China to Delhi to everywhere. Now, on the other side of it, there's kind of a source problem, which is that we have a lot of these recommendations for reducing air pollution sources and all these recommendations for solutions: switch to renewable, change your internal combustion engine, stop burning things. But if you look deeper at the reasons that these emitting activities are happening, they're a product of market, commercial, social pressures, and often the absence of alternatives. We've treated it as a regulatory problem. We've emphasized regulatory enforcement, but it's actually a much deeper rooted set of issues that's leading to the emissions. And so we need to get to these specific sustainable agendas for sources. And when you put those two things together and you say, what is it, that kind of meta solution that would start to move more of what we know into more of what we do and sustain it, we need to be able to tackle this entanglement in the middle. The fact that air pollution is the product of near and far and multiple sectors, the fact that emissions are the outcome of market, social, cultural pressures, that we need to be able to dive into that and do something about it. So I have two sort of solution sets that I want to raise, and then I'll be quiet. The first is, I think we really need to move from an attention to monitoring to thinking more comprehensively about source attribution systems. Now, this is not going to be new on the science side, but on the philanthropy, the multilateral investment, some of the newer kind of contributors to air pollution data, especially on the low-cost sensor, monitoring to get ambient air quality and to raise awareness is important, but getting into emission inventories, modeling, the combination of regional models and global models, using satellite products to look at emissions as well as ambient concentrations to trace the movement of emissions across geographies and attribute sources. We need to reframe what we're doing in data to look at source attribution systems. On the right, we have a graph that we use to kind of highlight the different components and shake people out of this idea that monitoring is enough. The second is on stories, and this is where art comes in. Moving from this bathtub model of put an emission into the atmosphere, you get pollution out, into more of a framing that looks more like inequality or social mobility, the deeper roots and the processes that lead to pollution. That framing really matters when we're looking for how to mobilize attention to the solutions that in some sense we already know. The second is that we need to pay attention and build the foundations for new collaboration, what we call institutional innovation. And there are three things: work across geographies, work across supply chains, work across sectors that don't, I think, get enough attention. So in terms of working across geographies, there are a growing range of examples to learn from. What happened in Los Angeles, South Coast Air Quality Management District, what happened around Mexico City, the Jinjiangji region in China, the Delhi National Capital Region just set up a new commission that gives it new transboundary powers. But I think on a regional level, the Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution, LRTAP, is far too unknown for its own good. It's an amazing piece of institutional infrastructure that allows this kind of collaboration. Working across supply chains, one of the things that people don't really think about too much is the fact that much pollution is created in the production of goods that are consumed elsewhere. We need to do something about that and to look at pollution. The number of times I hear pollution referred to as a local issue, it's not local in its origins and it's not local in its impacts. We also need to work more concertedly across the sectors and look at it as one atmosphere. The climate air quality divide, the divide between the transition movements on energy, waste, and food systems are far too fragmented for our own good. And I think it's on us as a community to not see that as kind of atmospherics, but to see that kind of deeper investment in foundations for collaboration as a solution, and not stay in this setting of sector by sector, technology by technology, whack-a-mole, or we'll have another few decades of air pollution, and then it'll just be probably, almost too late. So 2 systemic solutions, and I will end my show at that because I'm already over time.
Thanks so much, Jessica. I want to open it up for you to perhaps expand on some of the examples that you mentioned really quickly. So, talking about working across geographies here in Thailand, that's something that we've heard a couple of times, and even earlier this evening, and also from some of our colleagues at the United Nations SCAP, the regional, doing regional work on satellite mapping of transboundary haze. And that's a big concern in Thailand. So I wonder if you can bring in a couple of those examples, perhaps, and talk to us a little bit more about what are some of the models for particularly working across geographies that are working, and maybe some lessons learned.
Sure. So I think there are 2 points. So on the science part, I think there are. If you look at like the NASA GSCF model, NASA has a number of tools, also high split for looking at the origins of biomass burning and how it moves. One of the key things that we could do as a community is start to combine, is actually perform the social function of combining local data with the outputs from the global models that are running to develop more customized, higher resolution products that cities and communities can use. So it's a slightly different use of one's time in advancing air quality analytics rather than immediate awareness of one's personal surroundings. We have a project with NASA to do exactly that, just combine local air quality monitoring data with the outputs from the GSCF model to develop localized forecasts and alerts on incoming air pollution. On the other side of the question, one of the models that I really like to cite is actually the evolution of Mexico's Megalopolis Commission. So in the 1980s, there was a piece of research that was done by local and foreign researchers just on the impact of air pollution and what are some of the sources. There was also a lot of citizen awareness campaigns. And what happened was an informal group, the ProAir, it's called ProAir, an informal set of solutions across sectors that had no funding, no political authority, but was brought into the public consciousness as the right, more integrated set of clean air actions. And it slowly, over time, acquired political authority, acquired a budget, acquired a steering committee of the governors and heads of the different administrative jurisdictions in the Mexico City area. And over time, incrementally acquired the powers to be able to direct investment across sectors, to be able to invest in the both academic and regulatory science to understand sources. And I think the Mexico Megalopolis Commission is an example of how to sort of start and grow and assume more powers by painting a really vivid, public, well-communicated picture of the value of integration, almost faking it until you make it. And I think more so than examples from China or the US where the authority was given before the kind of public legitimacy, that's a very good example to learn from.
Yeah,
I would also, just one other, the one other example to learn from, and there's a fair amount of documentation, is the Long Range Transboundary Air Pollution Convention, which first set up a venue for different countries in Europe to speak with each other and to compare notes and to do sort of joined up science about the origins and impacts of air pollution. Then that forum became the venue for working out international voluntary treaties to be able to reduce pollution and to trade off emissions in one place for impacts in another. And it again acquired greater formality, greater powers over time as it developed more legitimacy. And I think it's an international convention, but I think it's highly relevant for federal countries or for other regions.
Yeah, thanks. The storytelling and this informal bottom-up solutions that then gradually acquired more and more agency and recognition, I think is an interesting example to bring in, because what we're working with the Thailand Clean Air Network on is really focus on the policy side as a key part as well. But then also through this campaign, trying to engage all the other stakeholders who are also working on this and bring up the sort of citizen action and civil society into that picture. There was a question related to this that just one more and then we'll move on. But do you think in the unsteady political environment in Thailand, which is perhaps struggling to raise air pollution issues at the government level, this should be top down or bottom up? And I want to, I think some of that came out in what you're talking about already, but I want to just offer you an opportunity to comment on that from the political economy perspective.
So I actually think that that a combination is required. I think taking advantage of the ability to put a law on the books as a sort of framing, enabling context for further investment in both science and solutions is really important. but a law alone, particularly in an unstable or unsteady political environment, will not go anywhere unless it has some degree of moral and intellectual guiding authority for how researchers use their budgets, what companies feel is acceptable, what people expect of their local enforcers or local leadership in enforcing that law. India, for example, has had beautiful laws on the books since the 1980s. They've lacked both sort of public investment to match the law, and they've lacked in some ways the everyday legitimacy to be unescapable. But I think that's growing with greater awareness. So this bottom up creates in some ways pressure to use the top down enabling conditions. Bottom up doesn't get far enough without that hook of an enabling law or framework for using public money. So I think it's unfortunately it's both, and it's going back and forth between both.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks so much. I know this is such a complex issue, and there's a lot to share. So I appreciate the ability to condense into a short introduction. So great start. I will turn now to Steve from the IFC, Stephen, and I have your slides here. So if you're ready, I'll just move to the Breathe Better bond. And we're excited to hear about how this relates to climate, how coming from a climate finance perspective and working on innovative solutions, we can think about how to fund some of these solutions that are needed, some of the investment that's needed to move the needle. So over to you.
Great. Thank you, Laura. And thank you for the invitation to join you here today. I'm Steve Bailey. I'm here with my colleague, Max Klotz, and we're both from the International Finance Corporation. For those of you unfamiliar, the IFC is really the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. So that's sort of how we fit into this space. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Breathe Better Bond, which is a program that we put together to help address air pollution and GHG emissions. The IFC, we have private sector clients, but these also include cities and subnational governments, so cities and states. And what we had found was that increasingly, the cities that we talk to, air pollution is a growing priority. And in fact, as Jessica knows much better than me, 97% of emerging markets have unhealthy levels of air quality. And this was starting to show up in the city priorities. So we felt we could combine some of the work that we do around climate and actually help address air pollution. And fundamentally, what the Breathe Better Bond is about trying to raise resources to help cities fund projects that will reduce air pollution and GHG emissions. The IFC and the World Bank I think are pretty well suited to actually do something like this. The IFC's got good climate expertise, but primarily it's a commercial entity. It's good at fundraising. It understands these things. And the World Bank has many levels of expertise, but also has much more air pollution technical expertise within it. So we find ourselves actually working a lot with the World Bank Group and trying to target cities and help them address these issues. And the final thing I'll say before we go to the next slide is this is a program. It got stalled a little bit because of COVID. It's a program. We have many conversations going on at the moment. We actually haven't transacted one of these issues yet, but we're hoping to do so in 2021. Next slide, please. So really the goal, as I said, is to reduce short-lived climate pollutants and greenhouse gas emissions. And the way we do this is we bring some technical assistance funding to help address some of the barriers. That's a very city-specific issue. Some cities are further along in certain capacity issues than others, but we bring some technical assistance to overcome the remaining barriers. And these can be financial, they can be data. If it's data, we're probably working hand in glove with the World Bank team. potentially legal issues, potentially issues around debt raising and so forth. So the various capacity issues. And then once this has been addressed, we bring funding to the city to help fund pollution reducing projects. Next slide, please. So this is a daunting slide. So really, if I'll take you through it, there's sort of three components to the Breathe Better Bond structure. The first is this technical assistance or grant funding that we provide to overcome some of these capacity issues, and these will also include identifying projects that we think would be effective and financeable. The second piece is then there's a debt issuance by the city. Typically, we're very supportive of capital markets issues in emerging markets, so we like the idea of a bond. There are cases where we would do a straight up loan, but there will be a debt issue at the city level. And again, we can be flexible exactly who issues this debt. It could be the city itself, but there are some issues around cities issuing debt, so we may be able to set up a special purpose vehicle. But fundamentally, all issuances will look to the city as sort of the core source of repayment. And then the final, and that funding will then be used to finance some of these pollution reducing projects. And the third thing, which is important, and in that debt issuance, IFC will act as an anchor investor. We can't buy all of a debt issue, but we can buy a piece of it. We'll act as an anchor, and that really helps attract other investors. And then the final piece is when you talk to cities, most cities, pricing is a very sensitive issue. There's just not a lot of money to go around. So we're looking at bringing some form of concessional support to help reduce the cost to the cities. In our discussions with impact investors and donors, they really like the idea of results-based payments. And for those of you not mired in this, basically the idea is if, say, the issuer, the city, achieves a predetermined result, and then funds are released. And the net effect of this is to reduce the cost of financing to the city. So the donors really like it because they get a very tangible, measurable, quantifiable result. And the cities like it because it reduces their cost. The problem with defining a result in a results-based payment for air pollution, it's technically very challenging. And we can kind of go into it. We've actually talked to Jessica in the past about this, and she provided some great insights for us as well. So we have some ideas around that, but we need to continue to work on that. Depends on the city itself. Next slide, please. So this is really this is quite an old slide now. This is sort of our initial, when we were designing it, takeaway on, because this is a global program. So what sorts of cities would make good initial potential targets? So the y-axis there is how bad is the problem? How bad is the pollution and the GHG emissions coming from the city? The x-axis is how strong a credit are they? How bankable is the city? So fundamentally, what you would like, and the size of the ball is the population. So really, you want to be in the sort of the top right-hand quadrant of the graph would be the ideal place to be. Ahmedabad, Delhi are obviously great candidates, but this is a very early screen, and you really don't know how well it's going to work until you start to engage with the city and start to get into the weeds of that particular city. Last slide, please. So this looks a little complicated, but one of the things we did, and as Jessica was alluding to, the atmospheric chemistry and the modeling is horrendously complex when it comes to air pollution, as everybody knows. It requires enormous amounts of computing power if you start to introduce projects and model them up and see what the impact is. There is a supercomputer somewhere in Colorado that we got to run a sample case for a South Asian hypothetical city. We took 3 projects that are based on real projects, solar plant, sustainable transport, and a waste project. These are based on real IFC projects. The amount of debt, and then we said, what would the impact of these projects be based on the model? So the city has to raise about 130 million for the equity investment in these projects. Another 387 million is raised at the project level. So total about $500 million. And the result, according to the model, was a reduction of 3.4 million tons of CO2 and about 2 million tons of PM 2.5 over an 8-year period. So very impactful, we think. It's also important to recognize that these projects are all revenue producing, self-sustaining projects anyway. They're not just trying to achieve these impacts, they're also economic projects. So the reductions in pollutants and GHG are in some sort of form, kind of a co-benefit, if you will. So we think that this is a very strong case you can make to cities about why they would want to consider doing things like this. And maybe the final comment I'll make, as I said earlier, we haven't done one of these. We are in conversations with typically with the World Bank group is doing air pollution work. We come in and we work with them. So once the air pollution work they're doing is done, and as Jessica was saying, you have some of the inventory apportionment studies done, you can figure out where the pollution is coming from. You can then start to dive into and try to identify potential projects. So we have conversations going in South Asia. We have one reasonably well advanced in Africa. And we're hoping to take one of those, excuse me, and provide financing in 2021. Thank you, that's all.
Yeah, thanks so much. We're really diving into the details of how to make this actionable. I want to, you've talked about this case study and the simulation and the amount of data, both from the understanding the market and understanding what kinds of actions would both be bankable, but also have a result on the startup side, but then also the challenges associated with actually measuring those results and quantifying them. Can you elaborate a little bit about what the enabling conditions are since we're talking in the policy landscape quite a lot here, and especially given this Clean Air Act that's being put forward in Thailand, from a regulatory or policy perspective, what are the enabling conditions that you're looking for in these places that you're considering or starting to work on the bond?
Okay, maybe I'll just, I think there's sort of two questions there, and I'll
okay.
One briefly, and I'll ask maybe Max to jump in if I missed something. So enabling conditions, huge topic, obviously. From our side, some of our cities, for example, they didn't even have the ability to measure the pollution. So you need that. You need the air pollution monitoring systems in place, and then you need to have done some modeling to try to identify projects and so forth. That's sort of a basic one. There's a whole bunch of other potential enabling conditions. Most cities can't issue debt. So if you can't issue debt, you've got a bit of a problem. So we have to be a little bit selective around those sites of enabling conditions. In terms of this results-based payment mechanism, and we actually talked to Jessica, I don't know if she remembers, a couple of years ago now. As she was talking about, it's a complicated issue, and pollution can blow in from the state next door or the city next door or the area next door. So you can have gone through and done a bunch of stuff to reduce air pollution, but because of these exogenous factors and just the complexity of it, your actual ambient air pollution may have gone up for a period of time because of the complexity. So to design a result, say that just says we're going to measure the air pollution in time 0 and time 1, and if it reduced, that's defined to be a result, is not really fair, because you might have done everything you said you were going to do and you still didn't get it. So where we're ending up, if you're trying to define a result, and the impact investors really like this stuff, by the way. This is what they want to see, not just the results, but also the health impacts and all these other economic impacts. You have to design something that is almost a hypothetical. You've taken 100,000 cars off the road. You can measure a hypothetical result from that. You can measure how many cars are actually off the road, and you can do a calculation and say, in principle, you have reduced air pollution by this much based on this calculation. And if everybody agrees to that, then that's a little more of a stable indicator that you could use to then have these result-based payments coming in on a periodic basis. Max, have I missed anything in that?
Just one thing that I would add on the enabling condition side, and this echoes what Jessica had said earlier. Monitoring is really just the start. The biggest piece that we see for our technical assistance, and something that we actually have ongoing now with some of our work with prospective BBB issuers, is source apportionment and emissions inventory. That's really the most important bit for us when we're designing projects and identifying projects. We need to know what will be, the most impactful, both from a financial and from a pollution and GHG reduction standpoint. So from that perspective, it's really important not only that cities have the ability to monitor and measure the pollution for potentially the results-based payment afterwards, but we really need to know the sources and how we can address those sources in the most cost-effective manner. So that would be the only thing I would add on the enabling conditions.
Thanks. I know that Jessica wanted to come in for a couple points.
I just had 2 sentences. The first one is that if I could do jumping jacks or some kind of like happy dance on Zoom, I would, because I think the fact that we're moving away from, in addition to monitoring this emission inventory and attention to sources, and more people are saying this, is wonderful. The second thing is that it is complex, but it is not as complex as, say, climate or others. There's decades of atmospheric science that can easily be brought to bear on this, and the cost and the ability to do rapid, good enough source attribution or differentiation between local and faraway sources is really very, very good and incredibly encouraging. And I think if we, as the kind of non-atmospheric science community, really paid a lot more attention to those capacities, and instead of reinventing, maybe worked more on translating and working with the science community, like the International Global Atmospheric Chemistry Project, like MapAQ, the Columbia Clean Air Toolbox, that this translation work is a very quick way to get to the capacities and the analytic work that we need. It just takes a little bit of translation between different professional communities.
Thanks, Jessica. I think that's a good point. And given that, especially, we have a lot of different kinds of audiences here, and it's great to hear about kind of the big picture of the larger scale funding, how to fund the larger scale systemic change from an infrastructure and urban systems perspective that really needs to happen. But then also think about how we can get there in a way that maybe isn't in those perfect environments of data and attribution. So I want to keep moving and switch gears a little bit and pitch over to Isabella, who is coming more from the policy and research perspective here in the region, where we are, at least in Southeast Asia. So I'll stop my sharing, and Isabella, over to you. And again, thank you to Kin, our colleague, who is putting in some Thai points in the chat to help everyone follow along. And if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll make sure that we get to those. So looking forward to those questions. All right.
Thanks
Over
so
to
much,
you, Isabella.
Thanks, Laura. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here and to represent my organization, which is the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air. I'm the Southeast Asia analyst for our team, and we're fondly known as CREA. But I think I'm going to take us back out in terms of solutions and talk about these very well-known solutions, long-term, medium-term, and short-term. And how we apply that at CREA. So what we provide is responsive research, evidence, and data. It fits squarely into what Jessica and IFC have been talking about, which is this bridging the technical understanding with what it means for stakeholders in the ground. So understanding the atmospheric basics, meteorology, different source apportionments and emission inventory, providing that research, but also translating that in a way that connects to people, follows up on policies, in many cases in the regions creates those policies. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that. So at CREA, we do think of solutions in three major buckets, and this is largely what's been agreed upon in this space, which is strong policy, a good understanding of the sources of pollution, where it might come from, and also understanding in terms of stakeholders and the people who actually breathe dirty air across the world. And also an understanding of what that is in real time through different timescales and tracking that in terms of data and transparency. For us, the modus or the mantra is that clean air solutions are also solutions to the climate crisis and the energy transition. One thing that we try and drive home, particularly in the region, in Southeast Asia, is that clean air, or the main sources of clean air as it's largely known, are man-made, and a lot of this happens in the energy space. And while we can kind of talk about that in very large term, what we try to do is translate that into the short term, into the more local level. So the solutions here are largely systemic. I think we can talk about the financing and all of that and how to get there. But it really comes down to three things for us in the long term, which is a national ambient air quality standard, or what's more fondly known as a Clean Air Act. That's in line with the World Health Organization standards and regulates the accumulation of sources from various sectors, which will differ depending on where you are, but this is kind of the overarching protective barrier there. That's why this project from the Circular Design Lab and the Thailand Clean Air Network is extremely exciting. But after that, we have to talk about, as Jessica said, the things that drive pollution and looking at the sources of that. So in the long term, we're talking about renewable energy dominated power mixes and clean energy and a restructuring or a reframing of the way that we design traditional cities, infrastructure, and transport options. And it's a particularly exciting time to be talking about these things in Southeast Asia, where we're seeing a lot of momentum in the energy space. So renewable energy costs are dropping like they are around the world, but also there's a burgeoning understanding of how fossil fuels are on their way out because they're less financially viable, or because we've been able to quantify the hidden economic and health costs of fossil fuel in a way that legislators or nationally people are able to understand. So positive indicators that have come up in the last 2 weeks include revisions to power development plans in Thailand and Vietnam that cancels out and reduces the share of coal in the energy mix. And in the Philippines, a new moratorium on coal. Of course, what we've seen is that the strength of these commitments and the follow through are particularly important. And that's why I think talking about solutions in sort of the short and medium term is also important to cover. And there's this understanding that stringent emission standards or limits placed on high emitting sectors need to be good is the bottom line. And this will differ according to industries, but what you want are limits that are requiring polluters to set standards that apply best available technology. And these have to be followed through with continuous emission monitoring systems to ensure that these technologies are actually working and that plants, vehicles, and facilities, industrial facilities are actually following through on these. and that the violation of these standards adequately deter pollution and actually consider the costs that might not be on a balance sheet or what traditional investors think about. And these are health, economic, all of those, environmental. So what we're seeing in the region is that emission standards have not changed, despite the fact that the major sources of pollution have greatly increased across the board. So we've included here the emission standards for places like China, EU, and India, where on paper, these are good emission standards. And you can compare that to major economies like Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, and Thailand. It's much, much higher and really don't do a good job of making polluters accountable to the type of emissions that they have on the daily and annually. Similar for vehicle emission standards. I think this is a really important thing to talk about as well, because in a lot of countries and cities, mostly, transport is a big factor here. And the enforcement of emission standards or policies are just as important as setting them. And from a research standpoint, and working with a lot of partners across the region, from very local community level all the way to top government, data transparency and convincing people and having them understand exactly where their sources of pollution come from, what robust policy can do for them, and how to keep that momentum moving forward is incredibly important. And solutions exist here in the private sector and in the public sector. But I think from a citizen level, seeing what ambient air pollution is like is particularly important and of interest to us. So one example that I wanted to plug was this really exciting initiative in Jakarta, from a group called Nafas, and they have a network of over 50 low-cost monitors installed across Jakarta, and it's probably one of the most comprehensive in the region. But what happens there is people are able to see these numbers, and suddenly it's much more real, and they're able to connect the experience with quantitative numbers that other sectors are able to understand. So this is where the good old monitoring solution comes into play. But I think going farther than that, what CREA hopes to do is bridge this local sort of bottom-up movement with the top-down, which is, as everybody has already mentioned, emissions inventory and source apportionment. So this is an example of the type of research that we provide and we try to translate for the people that we work with. So using satellite ground level monitoring data, putting that all together to look at specific sources. So this is an example of transboundary pollution from the Suralaya power plants, which are located 100 kilometers from Jakarta city. And these plants, so these plants are responsible for over 2,500 premature deaths per year, and we're able to quantify that number to 1.5 trillion rupiah, or 360 million US dollars. And that kind of gets the conversation started in terms of the air that you're breathing in Jakarta, to what types of solutions and policy recommendations that local CSOs and NGOs are able to push and advocate for the government, but also at what level those more medium-term big policy solutions should be set by governments. So yes, that's a big overview of the type of work. And this is the type of work I think we're trying to replicate and bridge across the region and across the board. So yeah, that's it.
Thanks so much, Isabella. This is great. It's illustrating so many of the things that we've just heard about from the other folks on the line as well. And I really enjoy this focus on the people-centered experience, and echoes back to what Jessica was saying about these, micro adjustments that people are making in their neighborhood or in their environment that they can control, and how that bubbles up to bigger action. And then also it's great to see that, you know, you're quantifying things in terms of health impacts, because I think that really, you know, what we've been hearing is that that really can be the way that this is communicated, that it makes sense to everyone. So both of those points to me speak to, you know, what we're trying to do through this campaign, which is really focused on, and the Thai Clean Air Act is focused on, you know, clean air as a human right, and how everybody should have the right to breathe clean air. So I want to keep this moving, and I'll go to Diane, who is working at the very local scale here in Thailand. And over to you, Diane, from Stockholm Environmental Institute.
Hi, thanks very much, Laura. I am just trying to find my PowerPoint presentation. Here we go. Thanks again to TCAN and the Circular Design Lab for having me as an advisor and for inviting me to talk today. I think it's great. I mean, especially as I live in Thailand, but more generally, I think it's great that there's this movement to try and push for a Clean Air Act for Thailand, and also to push for better air quality in general for the country and raise awareness about the issue. Can I check that you can see my screen?
Yeah, we can see it. It's not in presentation mode though. We can
okay,
we can see, but we can see your slides.
Hopefully it will be on presentation mode now. Yes, okay.
There you go,
so
perfect.
Today I'll be speaking about a couple of projects that we're working on or that we're just kicking off, which relate to the equity and well-being impacts of urban air pollution. Unfortunately, we have been able to work on this because Thailand has been very fortunate to avoid the worst of COVID. So we've been able to carry out some field work and gather some data over this year. And then I'll speak about a couple of projects that are just kicking off as well, which focus more on the equity impacts of urban air pollution. Before I go on, just a brief introduction of SEI. So we are the Stockholm Environmental Institute, and I'm based at the Asia Center, which is based in Bangkok. We have offices all around the world, including our headquarters in Stockholm. But if we're talking about air quality work in particular, I have colleagues in York who are specialists on air quality issues from probably a more technical angle, for example, developing the LEAP IBC tool, working also with colleagues in SEI in the US. But generally, SEI's focus is a research to policy institute. So we do research that should inform policy and help to lead to more suitable policies based on evidence. And we are very much shaped or driven by achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So quite a few of these are relevant to air quality, such as health and clean air. But we also, in general, in our work, we have three focus areas. So the first is on reduced climate risk, the second is on sustainable resource use, and the third is improved health and well-being. And all three of these are also very relevant to the topic of clean air. So today I'll speak about three projects that we've been working on. The first is the City Health and Wellbeing Initiative, which is a 4-year program of work. And essentially, we're trying to see how urban form and the ecological health of the urban environment affect human well-being. And I just wanted to share one of the activities that we did where we basically used heart rate variability as a proxy for stress. And last year, we carried out an experiment to see whether there was a link between the environment in which people are standing or walking and their stress levels. And then based on that experiment, which I'll share shortly, we've also decided to carry on this year with an experiment where we're assessing the general urban environment in terms of noise levels, PM 2.5 exposure, and temperature to see if that has an effect on heart rate variability as well. So we carried out the research in a town called Udon Thani, which is in northeastern Thailand. And in this experiment, we got people to walk from a fairly busy urban location, such as the market, and walk down a busy street, across a railroad, and then into a park, or vice versa. And so this is basically another view of the walk, where we can see the transitions and different types of areas that people walk through. And the results were quite interesting in that they showed that there was heart rate variability, which isn't explained purely by the physical exercise of walking. And so there does seem to be a link between the stress-inducing noise or traffic or motorbikes whizzing past and so on, and people's level of stress. Whereas once they get to the park, their heart rate variability reduces and they seem to be less stressed. So we've extended this research, and this year, unfortunately, I can't share the results yet. We're still analyzing them, but we've done something similar where we got people to sit in 3 different locations of varying noise intensity and varying green space. And while they were sitting there, we assessed the temperature, the PM 2.5, and carbon monoxide, and also noise levels. So hopefully we'll see whether that has any correlation with stress as well. So this is an experiment that we've carried out, and we'll see what the results show, but this is just to see at a very local level what kind of impacts the urban environment can have on people. The next project that I'd like to talk about is just about to start. Is a collaboration with Chulalongkorn University here in Bangkok. And basically, we're very interested in differentiated vulnerability and also differentiated exposure to air pollution. So certain people or certain population groups, by nature of their work, will face higher levels of exposure to dirty outdoor air in their commute or in their job. So for example, a street vendor, a motorbike taxi driver, or a security guard. So we will be using some tools such as BenMap to estimate the health effects of changes in air pollution levels at a very local level, so in a district around the university, and also try and assess the economic consequences of these varying air pollution levels. We plan to focus on a number of different population groups, probably groups that are more or less exposed to air pollution. So for example, people who work at street level, but also elderly population groups and youth groups. And we'll also organize some focus groups and workshops to raise awareness amongst these groups as well about the possible risks to their health of exposure to poor air and what they can do to try and protect themselves as well. So this is, again, focusing very much on a local level, but we hope through the process to be able to identify some mitigating measures that these population groups can take, but also help to raise their awareness of the risk they might be facing. And the third project, again, which has just started this last month and will be going for almost 2 years, is funded by IDRC, and we're working in collaboration with ILO. And again, we're interested in the differentiated vulnerability of different population groups to air quality, but not just in terms of direct exposure to poor air, but also some of the indirect impacts. So for example, if we have policies such as industrial emissions limits or crop burning regulations, which might not be integrated with other sectors such as labor markets. What are the unintended consequences, and how might these be particularly gendered or affect certain population groups or groups of workers such as migrant workers or youth as well? Or if we're talking about policies that mean all schools have to close when the AQI index reaches a certain level, usually the caring burden falls on mothers. So what impact does that have on their ability to earn an income? At the same time, what does it mean if mothers also have health impacts or health effects of their own as a result of their occupational exposure to air quality? So we're really interested to see how do policies around air quality reproduce inequality or exclusion? And who is it who really bears the costs imposed on employers if there are regulations requiring sort of minimum standards of emissions, for example? And what can be done to mitigate these impacts? So this is a project where we'll be working very much with stakeholders in probably 3 selected Southeast Asian countries. So we'll work with labor organizations, employer organizations, the relevant ministries. One thing we think is that there's probably not a lot of integration between the Ministry of Labor, the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Public Health. So this is maybe an opportunity to try and bring them all together to think in a sort of broader scale. But, you know, how can we make sure there are no unintended consequences of our policies and ensure that they do link up nicely? So essentially, that's a quick summary of 3 projects that we do that relate to air quality. And in particular, we're very much interested in the equity impacts of how we can control air pollution to ensure that we're essentially leaving no one behind. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Diane. And this really gets at the underlying, the underlying vulnerabilities as being, one of the ways that we think about solutions needs to think about not just, how do we have air filters or masks for people who are sensitive or exposed, but also, how do we get at the underlying vulnerabilities and the equity and access issues associated with air pollution. So I will pass it to Courtney, back to Courtney to facilitate a few more questions. And then also, if you have any questions, please place them in the chat and we'll open it up here. But over to you, Courtney.
Great, thank you so much. It's been really a fantastic past hour, just zooming in and zooming out, starting with Jessica sharing a little bit specifically on a more macro, perspective of systemic change. What are we doing? We have solutions. How do we reconfigure and connect the dots in certain ways? To then a deep dive into some of the ways in which there's climate finance and policy tools that are being prototyped and experimented with at a very technical level, but at a systemic level as well. And then, of course, just hearing a lot more in the context of the region, thanks to Isabel and CREA, and then tying it with very interesting ways of connecting it with social justice and equity issues that Diane has offered through the Stockholm Environmental Institute's approach to these different kinds of experiments. So just wanted to make a note. I see some comments and questions in the chat box. What I'd like to do is actually just bundle 2 in a specific questions actually to the panel, and then we can get to this and then close a little bit with a special question coming from Kun Mina, who is as we mentioned at the very beginning, the co-founder of the Thailand Clean Air Network, that's been doing a lot of the heavy lifting on the technicalities of moving a Clean Air Act forward. But one of the key things that we cannot ignore, right, is we see that emissions, for example, are actually surpassing pre-COVID levels. And so we had a minute of a pause, and I think that opened the opportunity thanks to COVID, with lockdowns to see clean air. And I think a few months ago, India was celebrating the fact that they could start, in certain cities seeing the Himalayas for the first time in several years. And then we hear of, literally what's happening on the ground right now. So if we're looking at the trajectories and the ways in which let's say COVID is recovering, we're not really seeing a green recovery at the moment. We are having more dialogue on about what the infrastructure for transition looks like. And so if, just as cited in The Economist last month in one of their special reports on the environment, if you take into account that we're in this trajectory moving in a certain direction of surpassing pre-COVID levels of emissions and pollution, and then there's a required additional 90% reduction to even come close to the Paris targets, I think what I'd like to hear a little bit around is what are you learning in terms of how to actually build the narrative or the ways in which you're discussing these technical issues with the spectrum of players that are required to collaborate to make it happen, right? So there's one way in which we would be sharing a story to a policymaker versus a civil society organization versus scientists. And I think, Jessica, to your point at the very beginning, we need these translators. So I just wanted to actually ask an open-ended question around how are you all as practitioners in this space pushing the envelope, crafting and learning about how to have the conversation, and what does that look like from a technical standpoint to have the infrastructure for the green transitions that we need. And we do see these targets being set, but to not have just incremental change, but systems change. So it's an open question. Feel free for anyone to chime in first.
I can share two things that we are doing at WRI, and then also with a larger consortium of partners, including EDF, Colombia, a group of, and the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. It's a fairly large consortium. So two things. One is on the bringing the science home part, we have been setting up a lot of participatory science experiments in which we don't just run the most convenient field campaign or research project, but we think of ways that non-experts can contribute in terms of collecting a piece of data, doing a transect walk to look at trash burning, to update an emission inventory. And so that they're part of creating the answer, and it takes longer time. Like we worked in Guadalajara in Mexico to work with city officials to look at differential exposure between bike paths and different intersections. And it makes the research take a lot longer, but it also means that people really own and understand and have a mental model that helps absorb what's happening with where the emissions are coming from. So I think participatory science is one thing, and sort of designing experiments to involve non-experts. On the other side, and I want to bring up an example from work we're doing in Surat, is to get to the root cause of why emissions are created. We're actually working with the industry. So for example, in Surat, we're working with the construction industry to try to understand, rather than don't create dust, what are all the different labor contracting technology choice? What are all the small things, and what would they like to change, and what would it take? And so we actually had one of the first agreements between the Gujarat State Pollution Control Board and the Industry Association to reduce construction dust, because instead of saying, don't do it, we're going to ban it, you figure it out, we actually said, okay, look, I mean, none of you gets up in the morning aiming to shorten lifespans. What's going on? And I think it takes longer. And unfortunately, a lot of funders won't invest in that kind of time because it's a social process. It's not a magic kind of quick fix solution, but it really helps make things a lot more sustainable.
Interesting, thank you. Does anybody else want to chime in? I think all of us, I mean, and the reason this question is being asked is because we are asking ourselves the exact same thing. We're preaching, ourselves are in the choir, right? And so when we are thinking about this campaign and trying to mobilize more people from bottom to top and top to bottom, there's just so much nuance in the ways, in learning curves, in ways that make it effective or actually not effective. So I'd like to hear actually maybe if Max or Steve would want to chime in. What are you learning as you're shopping around this idea that is actually quite complex in terms of a financial approach or a climate finance approach to something that often people are not intuitively thinking air pollution and this match together. Are there any kinds of interesting things that you've been discovering as you've been testing it?
Well, maybe I'll just start. One reason we did sort of combine air pollution with the GHG is, I know Jessica was saying, she was tiring of people saying air pollution is a local issue, but nonetheless, the climate issue it's exhausting to a lot of parties, and it's so big and it feels almost overwhelming that sometimes you can usually get people to agree with you that it needs to be resolved, but it's hard to get them to move. One advantage with dealing with air pollution is it is a little bit easier to move the needle. So if you can say Mexico City or China, listen, over the last 5 years, this air pollution has actually was significantly reduced in a reasonable period of time. We find that does help incentivize the public sector to engage, and that's an absolute crucial piece, that you do need the policies in place. I'm a private sector guy by background, and the longer I live, the more I realize that you need that component. Otherwise, all the private sector goodwill in the world isn't going to quite solve these problems. So I'd say that's sort of one thing. The other is on the risk side. We're increasingly being bombarded with these issues are increasing the risk to lenders and financiers and companies who need the social license to operate. And I think that helps actually move the needle when you point out to them that you need resilient infrastructure, you need to reduce these issues to get the societal buy-in. Otherwise, you're just not going to be able to, you won't be allowed to run in the next few years if you keep doing what you're doing. And that is helping us somewhat, but it's a mountain to move, that much is certain. I don't know, Max, do you want to add anything?
The only, excuse me, the only other thing that I would add is that we'd really have to rely, we really have relied on, outside resources, whether that's our colleagues at the World Bank, or even externally, to provide the technical expertise. Because of how complex the problem is, we found that in order to really be credible with potential investors that we'd look to market this product to, we really need to have a sound foundation on the technical side of things. So to that extent, we're really looking forward to working with some of you and continuing our work with the World Bank.
Great, thanks. And just to that question around narrative, which, as we do discuss what we have to cast the vision of what's coming in the future. Isabella or Diane, did you want to chime in on how you're also, road testing a lot of the things that you're experimenting with or pushing with? And I think CREA in this case is actually acting in that space as translators. So maybe you had some comments around that as well.
Yeah, I think there's still a lot of interest on the ground, be it local governments, be it local NGOs and CSOs, to understand the sources of pollution as well. So I think the pull is coming from all sides, and it's just a matter of getting these communities and people to talk to each other. What we've seen in a lot of countries is that the gaps that have been identified and that we often talk about, like data, policy, everybody knows about it, but they can't agree or build consensus because they're not talking to each other, and there's no common language to talk about solutions in various places, if that's local or national. So that's I think a very basic understanding, but one that I'm continuously being surprised by, that it's still like, oh, we want to deal with pollution, we don't know where it's coming from, we don't know what the solutions are. And really translating that, the translating work, I think, is something that, as Steve and Max and Jessica have said, it takes a lot of time. And I think building the capacity from the ground up and from the top down needs to happen simultaneously. And a lot of that is getting these groups to talk to each other.
Thanks. And Diane, is there anything else you wanted to, that's kind of any of this is provoking, as you are also, reframing and positioning a lot of the experiments in less usual ways. I think a lot of times people are not thinking about gender when they think about air. So it's quite fascinating to hear that. Any things that you're also picking up as you're moving this kind of work forward?
So I guess just 2 points. So with the project in Udon Thani, the walking experiment, I think it worked out quite nicely in that the municipality there has a vision at the moment to become a walkable city, to be a green city, to promote access to green spaces, and to be a healthy city and get people exercising. So our experiments about heart rate variability and the other elements of the project, which I didn't mention, fit in nicely with the municipality's vision, and therefore they're interested in the kind of results that we're getting because it can inform their decisions or back up their vision and help them to continue planning in that direction as well. So I think it's been a case of good timing that the municipality's vision fits in nicely with our project plans as well. And then on the other issue around gender and other sort of inequities and differentiated impacts of air quality on different population groups, I think it really will be a case, it might be a challenge as well, I think, to bring together the various sectors or stakeholders, because you wouldn't normally think of the Labour Ministry interacting with the Ministry of Environment, for example, in many cases. And then we have to deal with as well with the private sector, where there might be a reluctance, for example, to allow people in to monitor the air quality inside the workplace. So it will be a case of trying to build understanding across the board of what are the advantages of trying to address air quality. So for private sector employers, obviously a healthy workforce is a more productive workforce. But if they can also understand how actually there might be differences in how different members of their workforce experience air pollution, both directly in terms of their own health, but also indirectly in terms of the impacts on their family members, then that might help to then identify measures that can be put in place to try and help avoid any of the negative impacts of lowered productivity or time off work, whilst also trying to work towards a cleaner environment and reduced emissions as well. So we plan to work with the different stakeholders, bring together different stakeholders, and we also plan to have an online curriculum with online materials, so kind of like a massive open online course or a MOOC that can be accessible as well for people across the region on this topic as we go along.
Great, thanks. So I think as we're kind of wrapping, towards the end of our session, one of the things that we're constantly asking ourselves, right, is how do we accelerate this kaleidoscope of issues, taking stock of certain solutions or towards solutions that we're starting to notice. But one thing I'd like to do is pass it over to Weena, and just to backfill, I think what would be very interesting as well to hear a little bit more of the story around the 100 Questions Initiative, because one thing we didn't want to do is assume that we have all of the solutions, but sometimes it's about stepping back and looking at the problem from multiple angles. So I wanted to hear a little bit about this initiative that Jessica and Weena, I think that was the first entry point of how we all got connected. So maybe we could hear a little bit around what that initiative is, what you're exploring with the NYU's, I think, 100 Questions Initiative. And then Weena, we would love to hear from you, given your hyper-local, hyper-contextualized way of working in this space in the sector. And if you had any closing questions for the panel. So maybe first over to Jessica to share a little bit about that bridge and that work happening there, and then to Weena to close with our final thoughts.
Sure, and thanks for the opportunity. So the 100 Questions Initiative is something that GovLab, which is a think tank at NYU, led by Stefan Verwulst, is doing as part of an effort to change data use and data governance in a way that advances solutions to social challenges much, much faster. So the 100 Questions Initiative, which has worked across a number of different domains, WRI is the air quality partner, basically seeks to invert the question of what answers can I give you with all of these new analytics and data science? What can I show you? Into what are the questions that matter that if they were answered would change incentives, change awareness, change opportunities, change institutional possibilities. And to identify those questions by convening and going through an iterative participatory process with a wide group of people with different expertise. Reno was one of the people who joined us. And actually, through that iterative process, we get a big number of questions that's clustered. And the top 10 questions on air quality are still open for public voting until the end of November. So I'll share the link in the chat box. But please do weigh in. The current front runner is actually how can we use data to create more political momentum to act faster, which is a big question. But it's interesting that that's the clear front runner question right now. I don't know, Weena, as a participant, if you have other things to add about being part of this, starting with the question, moving to the data rather than the supply side. Here's some analysis, now go do.
Thanks so much, Jessica. No, the 100 question initiative was really interesting. It really kind of got you to think through sort of the issues in a more holistic way, and the way it's categorized, I thought was brilliantly done. My own question that actually ignited the discussion that Jessica and I had, something I probably want to throw to the panelists, is that when you look about the issue of air pollution, what struck me was there is this missing equity stake, which probably goes to the issue that Diane was speaking about too. But it's an equity issue at a very global level. So to the point that Jessica made, said, air pollution is not defined as a local only issue. There's an entire supply chain linked to it. So just to be very blunt about it, Asia as a region has turned into the factory of the world and has been so for many decades. And the end result of that is a lot of the pollution that we're facing. So it's a huge inequity. It's a structural issue at a global level. And what I don't see happening is a level of acceptance at an international arena of this, as you would say, more at a broader discussion level when we talk about global climate change issue. There seems to be a whole mindset narrative around, compensation, donors are there, funders are there to try to help with that transition, but that doesn't seem to be as predominant, is my sense, in the air pollution space. And just sharing on the Thailand context, I really, what we started off really at a very low lying fruit. So in the case of Thailand, PM 2.5 was something that kind of hit us left field about 2 to 3 years ago. And it was a simple case, and that's just because PM 2.5, although it's been monitored officially through various entities, it's never been included in the air quality index. So therefore, people don't know about it. I mean, for me, I was just really taken aback by the fact that the data has been monitored for the last decade, but it's not publicly available. So we didn't even know about it. And having to then suddenly realize, oh my gosh. And it was actually just noticing that people were very aware of it 2 years ago and really making a lot of noise. And that was what made the final push for the responsible agency to include PM 2.5 finally in the AQI. So that was the power of bottom up, but I completely agree that the top down is absolutely necessary. And I'm so glad people mentioned that, and that's the approach we're trying to do here. Because, people talk about air pollution in Thailand. And, right now the legislation really doesn't exist. I mean, there's no legislation that covers air pollution in Thailand. Everything falls under different ministry, and it's not more than A4 piece of paper. So it's so inadequate right now. Therefore, I guess a bigger question that I'd like to pose to people is ultimately it's a question of political will at a policy level or at a business level, and at a citizen level too, to want to protect their rights. So I'd be interested to hear any sort of success cases or sort of more the trigger point that nudges this to really make the change.
Rena, I'm going to jump in here and say I have this slide up about how thank you for coming in from your perspective from the Thailand Clean Air Network, and if folks are interested to learn more about what we've been doing, as Courtney introduced at the beginning, you know, here's a bit more information about the organization that WENA has spearheaded, as well as the draft Clean Air Act that is in process, that is citizen driven. And so there is a need, if you're a Thai citizen, to be able and are interested to you know, put your name forward as supporting that as well. It's a pretty interesting model here in Thailand. Unfortunately, I think there's so many fascinating questions and ways that this discussion can go, but we are at our time for today. And I really want to thank everybody for coming, and especially a big thank you to all of the panelists, and to Kin from Circular Design Lab, who has been, you know, a champion in the chat box, keeping the conversation going in both languages. Really quickly, oops, sorry. If you're interested, if you're here in Bangkok and interested, we do have a couple of in-person events coming up. We're very thankful to be able to do things in person right now for the moment. We are working with a couple of partners to do a DIY air filter workshop in a couple of weeks, and then also we'll have a more open-ended idea salon and networking event in the beginning of December. But again, really big thanks to everyone, and I know it's late in the evening here, and certainly early in the morning in DC and Vermont and places in between. So thanks so much, and with that I will close. So thanks.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of the day, and we look forward to continuing the conversations with everybody. We still certainly have more questions to answer as we go together. Thanks again.
Thank you, Courtney. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Ken. Have a good one.